So hi everyone, welcome to this Provar webinar, Spring 19 for Testers. My name is Hetty Borman-Weston and I'm Head of Marketing here at Provar. Presenting with me today, I also have Geraint Waters and Richard Clark, and I'll be passing over to Richard in a minute to kick things off. So as you know, this webinar today is all about Salesforce's Spring 19 release and what Provar's doing to support those new features and changes. So if we take a quick look at the agenda, we're going to start off by looking at the impact of Salesforce Spring 19 and how we're addressing that in Provar's latest version. We'll also highlight some of the important changes that are coming in Spring 19 in terms of what's relevant to QA. And then we'll move on to Geraint, who'll be talking us through some of Provar's other new features. So he'll also recap what's been delivered in the last few months and also what's on the horizon in terms of our Provar roadmap. So the webinar will last approximately 45 minutes and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So if you'd like to ask a question at any point, please feel free. You can do that by typing into the questions box and we'll pick these up at the end of the session. This webinar is being recorded, so I'll send the video around to all attendees tomorrow in case you'd like to watch it again or share it with a team member. So finally, from me, we do have a number of interesting events coming up in 2019, and these are a really good opportunity to meet us in person and get your questions answered. We'll be talking more about these as they get close to the dates, but you can always stay informed about all of our event plans by subscribing to our mailing list. So there's a link at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to do that at any point. That's it from me, so I'll hand over to Richard to start the presentation.
Thank you, Hetty. Hi, everyone. Great to speak to you all again. This month, I'm actually speaking to you from our offices in India, so we've quite a global presence today. And on our next webinar, the repeat of this one later today, we'll have John, our new head of North America as well, covering the spot. So it's a truly global business Provar, and I'm excited to be part of it. So let's talk about first some of the Provar release 196, some of the impacts of Spring 19, on test automation generally, and then what Provar's doing about it. So we're now on the spring release. So you're aware that there's 3 releases per year by Salesforce, and they give us access. So at the bottom of the screen, there's a link that will tell you all the planned Salesforce releases, all the release dates that they've currently planned out, which is normally 3 releases at once. And from that, we can usually predict when there's going to be the sandbox preview, which is when Provar first get our hands on that set of changes. And then shortly after we get that sandbox preview, we actually get a release note from Salesforce telling us what they've actually released. Unfortunately, we don't get the 2 things at once. And then we always try and get a release out so you're ready to start your testing. So in this case, we released the 196 release ready for the 5th of January, when most sandboxes were upgraded, or those that were scheduled to be upgraded were upgraded to the latest Spring 19 release. And then, of course, we've got the production release on the 2nd of February. So you've got that whole month basically to make sure Provar and your local customizations are all working. In terms of Provar releases, our next release, not surprisingly, will be 197. I've been here with the team looking at the testing of that, making sure that's in good shape. And Geraint's going to share some more information about what's in that release with you later today. So it's lots of exciting new features. And the reason that's in a lighter color than the 196 is that's going to be what we call an optional release. So we're going to have some new features, but we're not expecting there to be any significant changes that means you must upgrade. The 196 release is a recommended release if you're using Lightning, and 196, I'm going to talk some more about that in a second. So whether you need to upgrade to 196 or not does depend on your use of Salesforce in your company. So if your company is all using Classic, then I would say 196 is an optional release. I think we've got some great features, but they may not be necessary for your company and your situation. If your organization is using Lightning, that's Lightning Experience or Lightning, which are now called Aura components, then yes, I 100% recommend that you upgrade to version 196 of Provar, and we'll tell you some more about that in the next few minutes. So there's been some changes in Salesforce's Spring 19 release relating to the way in which tab navigation works and the way in particular Aura works. And I'm going to talk some more about something in a minute called Shadow DOM, which is a large part of those changes. And there's also changes in Provar's 196 to support changes that Salesforce made in the way iframes are named. So if you're doing your own navigation, if you have a custom framework, And that custom framework you will probably find is breaking on the Spring 19 release, okay, if you're not using Provar. And furthermore, there's changes. So currently in Provar, although page titles don't come across in metadata, Provar has a mechanism where you can inspect and assert values in page titles, which can be quite useful, very useful if you're doing translations as well. So again, there's a change in the HTML Salesforce are using for that. So if you're using any custom locators, then you are custom page objects, you may need to update them. But if you're using Provar's inbuilt locators, smart locators, Provar can do these actions for you, so you don't need to make any changes. So just be aware if you're seeing problems in these areas when testing Spring 19 with Provar, check your custom page objects, and there's probably some changes to make there. You can contact your support consultant at Provar, and they'll be able to guide you through what the specific changes are, okay? So one of those changes that Salesforce have announced, this is something that's always really been the case. So DOM inspection tests not supported. What they mean there is that in the past, it's been possible with custom frameworks using Selenium to sort of reach inside the page, reach inside to a DOM element, and to get a locator that was generally okay. Okay. In the Spring 19 release notes, there's a link here where Salesforce have made an explicit statement where they consider that not to be safe anymore. As part of Lightning, especially in Spring 19, Salesforce announced something called Web Components, which I'm going to talk about. As part of the Web Components standard, there's something called Shadow DOM. Now, basically, Shadow DOM is a way of encapsulating behavior of a component on a page so that any changes don't bleed or don't leak across. So it's a better way to build enterprise applications. So that encapsulation technique also means you can no longer use accessing the DOM to navigate to those components. So if you're using Selenium WebDriver and a custom framework, you'll probably see an error there. If you're using a custom page object, you may see an issue depending exactly what you're trying to do. And again, that affects people using Lightning experience. And if you're using Aura components inside an iframe Visualforce page inside Classic. So if you're using any part of Lightning, you should be aware of this, and you should definitely make sure all your regression tests are working fine. So the big question is Provar affected by this? So I can categorically say Provar is not impacted. We've already done all the work in 196 to protect you from this. So Shadow DOM support has been built in Provar for the last couple of years or so since we first worked with Salesforce CPQ. So that was already using Shadow DOM. And the way we access that Shadow DOM is through the public JavaScript methods that Salesforce make available. So they're published API. So if you read that statement, it talks about not reaching into the DOM because that's not a supported API. So we're not using DOM inspection to do that. So custom frameworks most likely impacted. Page objects may be affected, but if you want to be safe, we've been putting a lot of investment, a lot of time now, Aura by locator to be able to use that instead of things like XPath. So to try and make that as robust as possible for you. So please, if you need to redo your locators, do try out the Aura by locator, which works for a larger number of test cases now. Another thing I want to make you aware of, something that's been reported to us by our customers, is there is an impact on Classic in Spring 19 as well. So if you're using Spring 19 with Google Chrome and Classic, there is an issue when you try and interact with a button that has an alert. So what you'll see, the symptoms will be you'll be having a page, maybe your action clicks on a delete button, you'll do a handle alert in Provar to click the OK. And then instead of disappearing, the original page is still shown. Now, if you were to then open up the JavaScript console, you'll see some kind of message in red saying uncaught reference error, nav with token is not defined. Now, this is a known issue with Salesforce, not a Provar issue. And there are posts about this on the Success community. And we've got a link for that here. Now, the solution is quite easy. You just have to clear your Chrome browser cache. Now, if you don't know how to do that, I just move my GoToMeeting out of the way, your Chrome widget in the corner here, you go to More Tools, you go Clear Browsing Data, and then you need to go and clear, probably on the advanced, not for the last hour, but the all time, and then the various things, your browsing history, your cookies and other site data. If you don't want to delete everything at once, you can try deleting these one at a time, but it is a big impact, but it's not a Provar impact. I just want to make that clear. Okay. So let's talk about the positives. Let's talk about some of the feature highlights in Spring 19, which we think QA teams will need to be aware of and benefit from as well. So as part of Spring 19, Salesforce have added a new way to put custom help resources. So under the help and training menu in Lightning, under the question mark, admins can now add in sections and documents or website links to your internal, maybe intranet or help pages or something else about your business processes and how that affects your users, which is a great feature that was possible in Classic but has now been added to Lightning. Now, you may want to, as a test team, you may be impacted by that. You may need to assert those values, and you may want to check the correct links are available. So you may need extra test cases to handle this. Another new feature, now this one isn't enabled by admins, it's automatically enabled, is the concept of pinned list views. So again, when you use things like Classic, any list view you chose became the default list view you saw when you went back to that tab in Salesforce. In Lightning, it's been behaving differently. So for the last 4 years now, in Lightning, the list view was always the recent items, which is very annoying, okay? And in Provar, what we've always done is the list view you select, we capture as part of that test case in Test Builder, and we set that to always navigate on our UI on screen step. If you've been changing that from always navigate because you think, I don't need to load it again, it's on the right page already, then if your user that you're running as is using pinned tabs, they're pinning the all accounts list view or my accounts list view, then that could impact the test case you're running. So if you're using always navigate, you haven't got to worry about this. If you're not using always navigate and you've been changing from the default, just be aware of this. You may see some of your test cases failing at list view because it's not seeing the list view in the columns that it expects to interact with. Another new feature that's been added to Lightning that was previously in Classic is the concept of case hierarchies. Now, that's the ability on a case, and I'll demonstrate this later on, where you can see all the cases that are in a chain of communication with that customer around that case. So there is a new button called View Case Hierarchy on the Lightning layout, which you can map with Provar. And it works in a very similar way to account and contact hierarchy. The columns that are displayed are customizable by your Salesforce admins as well. So if your admin chooses to make a change, then you will see these columns may be different to the ones on the screen here, and your test case will need to take account of that. Another cool feature that's been added is contact roles. So Salesforce has had contact roles on the account and opportunity object for some time. They've now been added to case as well, and they work in a similar way. So your admin, again, would need to enable this feature if your users want to use it, but you may, again, want to add this to your test scenarios. There may be an important part of the interaction. I know the projects I've delivered in the past, we've automatically added contact roles to an opportunity. I imagine your development team will want to automatically add contact roles to a case for premium customers or for escalation points, etc. So again, this may be something you want to test, and the good news is Provar 196 supports this too. Another new feature is printable views. Again, I feel like a broken record here. Classic had this, now Lightning does. So we support the additional button that's now automatically appeared for printable views. Unfortunately, Salesforce have added the button, and what we get is a very dull looking page, exactly how it looks in Classic. Now, we'll let you map the button and capture the screenshot, but as of the current time in Provar, we haven't decided that there's any benefit in mapping these fields that appear in the screenshot, because this is just a PDF or printed representation of the page you already have on details. So there's no value in testing that the account name is the same on the printable view as on the details tab. Salesforce have already done that. There's nothing new here. Another cool feature that's been added are activity actions. So within a page, you can have an activity, you can have a history of interactions with a customer. And Salesforce have added some one-click actions, which makes it much easier for people to interact with that menu. So that includes a new checkbox for clicking that an action is complete, a new button on an individual task to mark complete, and a new button when a task is complete to reopen it. And Provar supports the clicking of all those actions. The addition of these is something else that you may want to test because they appear automatically. And if you have custom workflows around the handling of tasks and activities and events, or custom validation rules in your org, again, you may find these fail due to some field dependencies. So it's definitely something you want to test before this goes into your production org. We've got page object support for the forms that will pop up after you click these actions. There are some scenarios where you mark something complete, which wasn't previously in progress, where when you reopen, it will ask you what status to go back to. So as of 196, you need to do that as a page object. In 197, you'll be able to map that correctly with the status field. So now I want to talk about web components. So web components are a big change in the Salesforce Spring 19 release. And there's something called Lightning Web Components I'm going to talk about, which is leveraging that framework. Now, the reason for this change, some people said, why didn't Salesforce do this back when they introduced Lightning, is in 2014, there was no other choice. So what we saw in 2014 was on the left-hand side, there were all these different JavaScript frameworks for handling enterprise-style applications, responsive websites, that kind of thing. So all the things in green were being handled by frameworks such as React, such as Angular, and the Aura framework that Salesforce wrote for themselves. What we've seen over the last 5 years is an evolution of those JavaScript standards driven by the key players, people at Microsoft, people at Salesforce even as well. All those different players have come together and agreed a new set of W3 specifications for what browser should support. So we've seen a number of those web standards now being handled within the browser instead of within some interpreted JavaScript libraries. Overall, that should mean user performance in these browsers using web components should be faster than using traditional tools. Now that has a direct impact on things like Salesforce, where they've basically taken those standards and leveraged them and released them as part of the Spring 19 and given developers a way to build their own Lightning Web Components. So your developers may be a bit confused. They've now got the concept of Lightning, now called Aura Components, and Lightning Web Components, which is a whole new way to write components in the Aura framework or Lightning experience. So Lightning Web Components is the adoption of that W3 standard for writing those dynamic enterprise application components. Overall, your developers will find Lightning Web Components execute faster and are easier to write than using Aura. Now, the good news is Salesforce have actually been using this for their what we call their base components, things like Lightning Input, for some time now. So they've already been using that internally. What they've changed is that they've now exposed it to developers. So those Lightning Web Components can interact and work alongside those Aura Lightning Components, or Aura Components they're now called. And all the features of Lightning Web Components should be browser compatible out the box. So Salesforce have only chosen to use those features that supported across Edge, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, for example, so the latest versions of those browsers. So that's the real change. If you want to know more about Lightning Web Components, there are some useful links. You might want to take this screenshot. So these bit.ly links for Developer Force, there's a good introduction. There's also a LWC Lightning Web Component launch page as well. So again, a good link for that. And I encourage you to look out for your local Global Developer Week. So all the Salesforce developer group communities around the world are having a 2-week period where they're having a nightly session or a lunchtime session. And the link here will tell you where your nearest group is, if they're having a session or not, and when that is, and how you can sign up for it. So I do recommend doing that. And finally, there is a sample apps gallery of about 7 applications Salesforce have released that already have implemented Lightning Web Components. So your developers can start with something that already works. And at Provar, we're going to be using these sample apps to test out our support for Lightning Web Components and working out whether we're going to change our Aura by to support them, or whether we're going to have a whole new LWC by, or whether we're just going to use XPath, etc. So we'll give you further information on Lightning Web Components, but as of now, virtually no one's built any except Salesforce, but we're going to be ready for you to support you on that journey. If you've been part of the Lightning Web Component pilot and you'd like to talk to us about changes to Provar to support it, please get in touch with me or Geraint. Thank you very much. So some final non-test impacting features. So within Lightning, Salesforce announcing that in the Spring 19 release notes that in Winter 20, it will be auto enabled as a critical update. Now, don't panic, because you can still opt out. So that critical update can be deferred. You don't have to go to Lightning. However, you may find this is incentive for your internal teams, your Salesforce COE, to go ahead and move from Classic to Lightning. As a Provar customer, you are in a unique position where you can help your team do that migration. You can take your Classic tests and run them in Lightning and be part of that process, which will greatly improve their chances of migrating across from Classic to Lightning. I also recommend that you're part of that process of any planning and any planned rollout, rather than a victim of it. Okay, the last thing you want to do is to be given a 2 weeks notice that we put in Lightning in 2 weeks. Can you guys just test it suddenly? So do be part of that process. Do work with your admins and understand what their Lightning migration plan is. And then we have a couple of features that are in Lightning in Spring 19 that I think are quite cool, but I don't think you need to test them. So the first one is something called pop-out Lightning utility components. So I'm going to demonstrate those to you. And the second one is how sub-tabs can be promoted to workspace tabs. So let's take a quick look at those ones. So here I am. It says Summer 18 at the top, but this is actually a Spring 19 org. And at the bottom of this page, I've got a utility bar. It's only got history in. Now in Spring 19, there's an extra widget in the top right corner. Now if I click that, well, normally it pops open, not in the whole page, but in a separate window. But as I've maximized my window here, let me just take that down a bit. But the concept is basically to allow you to run that on another screen. So if you've got multi-monitors, here we go. So I think that was a bug from Salesforce myself, but that pops open in a new window, and I can drag that around and maybe put it on a different monitor. Now, the interaction of the page that's contained doesn't change. So if you're testing this, which you can do in our Spring 19's, our 196 and 197 releases, if you're testing the utility bar components, then that testing is exactly the same whether you pop it out or not. So we don't consider the need to press this makes any functional difference to your tests. But if you feel I'm wrong about that, please feel free to get in touch and explain why that scenario is important to you, and we'll discuss how you can do that. The other change is here I am within a case record. I'm actually going to show you the view case hierarchy button, which is also new in Spring 19. So we see here I've got 3 cases that are connected. And if I click on one of those cases, it opens in a sub-tab. So what you can now do in Lightning Console is you can click on this down arrow and you can set that as a workspace tab, or what we used to call a primary tab, and it appears here and it lives independent of the other record. Now, again, there's no functional difference in behaving with this. So you don't need to test that opening a workspace tab works, okay? So there's no need to write a test case to cover that, in my opinion. Okay, let's move on. So Geraint's now going to take over and show you our new features that are not related to Spring 19.
Thank you, Richard. So yeah, as Richard said, we're just going to go through new features now. I think the following slides really just talking about what I'm going to cover, and I'm going to do demos for each one of these. So firstly, we're going to cover some audit fields. So some of these are big, some of these are small, but we're just going to cover them all. A nice feature about rerunning test cases, some additional variables around email, an expansion on what we support for data-driven tests, also some browser options and how to use them, and that's specifically around doing different language testing within the browser, and then also some mobile browser emulation. So let's have a look at Provar. So a lot of you would have seen this before. What I've done is just launched a test case here, which is my first test case I want to cover, which is really around the system audit fields. So what we can see here is our browser on the left-hand side, test builder on the right. And what we have is the slight change here around the system information field. So previously the whole field would have been sucked out by Provar, and now we'll notice if we do a sort of add to test case here, that what Provar is doing now is it's pulling out just the created date portion of this. And if we did want to reassert it, you'll see that we've got our date timestamp exactly the same if we go and have a look at the sort of user side to this, we can see that that's pulling out the created by ID. So a small change, but something we felt was important to do to make this very clear. So you can see that's pulled out separately. Now, when we come to assert that, so you can see we're on an assert step here, what we're able to do is, you'll see that's passing for us. But why is that passing? Because again, we've got a bit of a date timestamp going on there. So the thing the UI assert's doing is it's pulling out the created date, but because it's extremely hard to test time, of course, because a lot of the time we don't want to go down to that level. What we're doing is we're doing a starts with, so it's just a bit of a reminder of some Provar functionality. And then secondly, the date format actually is slightly different, because obviously these things change by locale. And you'll see I'm just sort of showing you an example of some of the functions. Again, if you're not familiar with these, it's in our control spacebar. And what we've got is a combination of date add, which is making this 2 days into the past, and then also mandating the date format. And these are just standard Java date formats. So if you, again, just a little reminder how that works. Now, my own opinion would be, why are we going to the UI to test that type of information? Because another way of doing it might be via the API. So this is where what we can do is drag and drop a test step here from org browser, and we can choose read assert. And these guys are all sort of easy to test from in here. You can see the last modified date. We can see the last modified ID. We can choose OK for that. And what we can see now is straight away that will automatically grab you the asserts whilst pulling out the ID. The ID, of course, can be passed in as a variable. So here we can see it's pulling out the date portion, and the last modified ID is a user Salesforce ID rather than the actual name itself. You could do subsequent sort of SOQL queries if you wanted to look up that value. So just a reminder that there's more than one way of doing things in Salesforce, in Provar sometimes, and some are quicker than others. So that's the first thing I wanted to cover, is our system audit fields. I think the next one I want to look at is sort of rerunning of test cases here. So what we've got, again, for rerunning test cases, we can right click on here and we can run this whole folder. You can even sort of press your control button and choose multiple ones if you wanted to within one execution. If we choose run, what we'll see is this guy will run down the bottom of our screen, and there's 3 test cases within it. One of them is going to be a passing test case, two passing test cases, one failing. The failing one, just so you know how that works, is just literally there is a please fail me API you can drag into your test. So all well and good, that's failed successfully for one of the tests. And at this point, what we've got is a new option over here. The option is going to allow us to say, well, what do I want to do here? We've got 2 choices. You can either rerun the whole thing. So if you are sort of running a suite of tests out of a number of folders, rerun all is quite quick and easy just to sort of get that running again. And, let's say, for example, you do have a certain area of the system that's been updated. Certain test cases are the ones that have to be rerun first. That's a great way of keeping doing that. The other one is actually an interesting one where we just run the failures. So obviously, if we're happy with the passing ones, we don't need to keep running them. We just want to keep down to the failing one. So if I choose that option, as you can see, the only test rerun in that case is the failing test. And then that's sort of just a bit of a time saver for people. So hopefully in 196, give that a go and let us know your feedback. The next one I want to cover is around some additional email variables. So here's our test case. In here, we have our subscribe, our send message, and also a wait for. So if you're curious to know where these come from, if you're not doing email testing already, what you need to do for email testing around Gmail in this case is that you would set up a connection. So our connections view down here will show us that, and if we wanted to do an add new one, it's this green button. But what we've got is actually one already. So let's just have a look at that one. You can see it's been set up to be my own email address. In this case, you might want to set up a test one for your project. As long as it doesn't have, if you want to do a bogus Gmail one, you're able to, but just make sure it doesn't mimic anyone's name. It's very clearly a technical email. I think you're usually okay. They'll close you down if it looks like you're saying Joe Blogs or something. But here we've got my name and you've got your authorization process. Now, once I get that, I get this view in Provar, and that actually shows me, in my case, all my folders in my Gmail. And if I want to find the APIs, you drag and drop them from here and you get send an email, subscribe. Now, what this test does first, and it's important to do it first, is it's subscribing. That's essentially polling my inbox. Then it's sending an email. Then we're waiting because it's an asynchronous event. In this case, you can see it's waiting for the message count to be greater than 0. And then it will basically allow us to move out. And it's actually doing a sleep for 30 seconds. I think it's a bit too much. I'd probably move that down to 5. So let's run this test. And what we'll see is the initial subscribe happening, where it's telling us, OK, I'm now attached to your Gmail. Then it's going to say sending the email to the exact same one. If you watch down the log file, we should see another entry. That other entry is the real-time view of the message coming in, received message for Gmail. That will get fired each time. You can always filter on the subscribe step if you want to. Now, we're currently at the point now where we're sort of going to wait for the thing and we're going to assert. And in this case, we're asserting one of these new variables. We're actually asserting the reply to thing, which wasn't previously being captured by Provar. Now, again, a great way of checking API steps is to essentially use our variables view. So if we now click in, the subscribe step is defaulted to home email, as you can see, and we can see there's a home email object in our variables. And if I then drill through here, we can see it's got one entry, and that one entry is my email. We can see, as usual, all the things like the body text, the signature, that type of thing. But what we're seeing new is things like the reply to, we can see the received date, that type of thing. So it's just extra information in there, which, again, came through sort of customers requesting that. The next one we want to move on to is data-driven testing. So here we have our 2 new types of data-driven testing. We have CSV and JSON. So let's run this test. Again, what we've got is a breakpoint here. So let's run it up until that point. We'll run it with debug again, because again, this is a API test, not a UI test, and debug will allow us to sort of do that. Now, what we'll see here is it's already done the read of my CSV. So the CSV file in question, in general, we recommend putting it into a templates directory. To be honest, you can create your own named directory if you want to, but templates is defaulted there. What we've got for CSV, if we open it up, we can open that up with text editor, and we can see it's a pretty simple file. It's got 3 rows in essence in this particular file. So what I'm expecting to see in this test is I'm using a for each that's going to loop through every row in the CSV file, and then with each row create me an opportunity. So if I go ahead and run this now, what we'll see is, so the run is going to do a step, of course, so we move through it. Importantly, what we'll see over on the right hand side is, again, another real sort of value for the variables. So if anything goes wrong, it's not working, I don't understand what's happening, then obviously what's happened is when it read in the CSV, it read it into a variable called CSV data. CSV data is now inspectable in variables, and I can see it's got 3 rows. Then I'll know that the current row we're on is dictated by this value name here on the for each, and I can drill in and just see, okay, the current execution is doing probability of 10 and stage is prospecting. Again, if I'm happy now, I'm just going to choose resume. That will just run through, and you can see it's then going to do a breakpoint on JSON. Now, the other thing we can now do is, of course, in exactly the same test case, this time around, it's just using a different input. Now, let's have a look at the file. We're seeing that we've now got something called JSON data, and we can see it's got a group called ops, and this time there's just 2 rows. And if we want to see our JSON file, again, it's in templates, and we can see that it's quite straightforward. And of course, you could have far more complex JSON if you're wanting to. A good use case for this, John was pointing out to me yesterday, is that sometimes you have other systems generating data for you, and that can easily be in the format of JSON. So this might be a useful use case for different people. Now, the one area to show you is that if you wanted to add a new one of these, typically this top level here is a group step. Now, if I just show you in the how you'd create that, you'd create a group step like this, and that's really just a container for other things. Now, what I wanted to show you quickly is just how we would do this with databases, because actually it is also supported. What we have for databases, again, you'd have to set up a connection to that database. And then once you have it, what we're able to do in any of these steps is you add a new parameter value source. So this is where we're sort of initiating this read for data driven. And if we choose database, you'll see that all the different entries are in the drop down. The connection is going to be the connection we have down here, Oracle DB. And then the way this works is we have a view of data of this Oracle database we can see down here. So this is exactly what we get straight away when we create our connection for Oracle testing. But of course, we are suggesting we're actually supporting other databases as well, and soon to be DB2 as well. And the way, if you wanted to do this, you can just put your SQL in here. So that would work like this. And you can see from the bottom what all the available tables are. I could just choose something like that. And you'll see Provar does validation, for example, to understand this is a valid query, and ultimately we can sort of use Oracle instead. I would tend to use a database if you're talking about large volumes of data. All right, so that is data-driven testing. Next on my list is I want to cover basically browser options. So what we've got here, at any time, by the way, if this is getting cluttered, you can just close all, right-click, close all, save that down still. We'll open up this test. So what we've got here is an example where we're wanting to test different browser options. Now, first and foremost, what we're going to use is we're going to use Booking.com. The reason for that is that Booking.com is an application that will actually react to locales and how your browser is set up, and it will present different languages. So what we have here inside our variables is a number of options around our browser. So you can see here I've got two options. So Firefox is a new one, but we've also got Chrome options, which we supported for a while. What we can see from these environment variables is that it's actually saying that internal accept languages equals ES is basically telling Firefox to be Spanish, and it's telling Chrome to be Dutch. If you're wondering where this is obviously something which is always going to be the same from Provar's perspective, but this can vary. So this is just two examples of many. So if we go and have a look about what the many are, for Chrome, you can go through this link and it will be on our help pages. These are the options. A lot of them are things like debugging Chrome and all that type of stuff. But in general, Provar supports this and you can add them. For Firefox, very similar set, but of course different strings. So if you're interested in that, then by all means have a look through that. But in general, what we're using this for is to be able to test running with different languages. So for example, if I now launch this particular test, let's run it, for example, still in Test Builder, we can close down existing run here that we have. But if I just launch this guy, what we should see is it will just launch into Dutch just because of that. Now, you might have also seen earlier when I did a right click that actually Chrome itself knew that it was in Dutch, and you'll see all the menu had gone Dutch as well. So here we go. We can see Booking.com automatically now comes up in that language, and you can see actually Chrome is very much thinking we're in Dutch as well. So that's a very nice way to do different language testing if that is a requirement for you in the future. What we also have finally is some mobile emulations. This is the last demo I'm going to sort of show you in this section. So mobile emulation is essentially where we have the option to launch our particular test case, but in the way it would launch on a mobile. So it's actually not having to go through the process, and we do have mobile support. We've got a great webinar we'll talk about later that will start to talk about those features, but in this case it's more of an emulation. So what we're going to do is launch this guy, but in order to do that we need to do some setup. So if we look in test settings, what we have is something called browser providers. Now browser providers, all of you will have an entry called desktop, and if we go inside this guy and edit it, we'll see that we automatically get let's just reset my perspective there. What we automatically get is this. If anyone's ever wondering, by the way, if you ever delete or get rid of a particular sort of window here, you can always reset it back to the factory defaults as such and choose to sort of pull this up. But there's our test settings. So what I'm trying to do here is edit my desktop. There we go. So what we can see is we've got these guys at the top are all standard. So that's very much pre-configured. What we've got in addition to that is an extra one called iPhone. Just so you know what these are, if you ever want to sort of mimic a particular size of screen resolution, you can do that. The full screen's an interesting one because it allows you to always leave space for Test Builder. But what the iPhone guy is a new one. And if you choose this, you can always create a new one with this. But if I want to edit this one, we can see it's got a number of options. So I can again give it the width and height, and I can give it a user agent string. If you're wondering what that is, it's the operating system and sort of device type that we're trying to mimic. Again, if you want to know more information about those strings, we'll have a link here which we'll share as well about how you can sort of get those values. Now, in our case, if we want to run this, what's going to happen is I have to choose that iPhone device type from the list up here, and then I just need to launch this test case. And what we should see is this case, it's Amazon. I've chosen Amazon because it has a different layout if it's mobile, if it thinks it's mobile, versus actually if it thinks it's a desktop. If you just resize the browser, you would not get this view. And you can sort of see here, we have our Amazon view, and we can sort of, obviously in the usual way, right click on fields and map these elements. Okay, so that is what we want to talk about for new features. The next thing I wanted to cover was we have our Salesforce CPQ. So Richard mentioned earlier, we've been testing Salesforce CPQ for some time. Initially, we found it a big challenge. Reason being is it's been supporting the use of shadow DOMs for some time. And that's really version 2.10 and earlier. Now, what was really interesting is, contrary to the sort of lightning approach that we're seeing in Spring 19, is shadow DOMs disappeared from Salesforce CPQ and was testing against sort of more standard components in HTML. Now, equally, Provar has done the work required to make that all very testable. There is still certain challenges in testing Salesforce CPQ that we bring a lot of value to, and we have specific locators for that. That's all great. So anyone on 2.16, then that will be supported in the latest version. We also have version 2.18 on the horizon. Now, we're just currently looking to analyze that to see what the technical direction is with this, and we're also reaching out to Salesforce. But one thing to note is that actually Salesforce CPQ is shortly going to be forming part of the standard Salesforce release cycle, which I think is really good news. It means that we all get the pre-release windows of how things are changing. And I think you can opt out, but at the same time, more times than not, we'll just be taking those updates going forward, which makes it an awful lot easier for the test team to test.
Hi, Garrett. Just to update on that one. So unfortunately, they're not yet going to be releasing it to us in the pre-release window, but they are doing push upgrades at the same time as the sandbox preview. So for the short time, we're still in the same situation where the first time we see new CPQ releases are the same as yourselves, but we are working with Salesforce to try and be involved sooner in that cycle.
Brilliant. Thanks, Richard. Okay, so everything I'd previously talked about was 196. 195, there was quite a major piece of functionality that really was driven, again, by customer requests, federal government, big pharmaceutical request, is that we need encryption. So currently our secrets file is stored away in a clever place and you have to decipher it. But in general, when you back up certain files to your Git repository, it's in plain text if you know where you're looking. Now, again, that may not be any issue at all. And for the majority of customers, that's all fine. You can always put X permissioning in Git if you want to lock that down. However, what we have done is we have a new piece of functionality that does support encryption. The objectives of that is to never expose secrets in clear text in the UI or any log files, never transmit that particular secret across networks, and also for maximum security, the way this works is that the user, as in yourselves, would supply a password, which only you know, and Provar doesn't know it. We don't store it down. So in essence, if you manage to lose your password, you'd need to go back in and add all your passwords again to your project, which again isn't the end of the world, but in reality, it's the only option. We can't have a backup to that. Now, the implementation can be applied at the project level. So again, across the board, you can just make every password encrypted. Great. Now, the other nice feature is that we can override it for a particular environment, which again, the rationale for wanting to do that is you could want to say, well, UAT, everything wants them encrypted, but UAT needs to be even more encrypted, just so a certain group of people know what the password is for UAT, whereas everyone else is just using the usual password. So bit of functionality there. I mean, some people may want to use Provar for production, bit of and again, that's even more reason for that type of functionality. We also support that password encryption for Ant, and interestingly, there are plugins for things like Jenkins that do manage environment variables, and it could be you want to store it at that layer and pass that into the Provar execution. So that's an option as well. Let me just give you a quick overview of how this is working in Provar. So it's quite straightforward to get your heads around. Is you just right click at the top level here, and you can see we've got encrypt secrets as an option. If I choose that, you do need to give it a secret. And once I've done the 2 passwords and encrypted it, we're done. Now, in essence, we then have at the top level a few more entries where we can change it. Unencrypt, you need to do the password for that. And actually, oh my God, I've completely forgotten it, reset it. And all that really does is remove all your passwords. You need to go back in and update them. Now, that's all done. I think the secrets file is this guy down here. If we open that up, what you'll see now is it's all pretty much, doesn't mean anything to anyone. So this is the very important file still, because this is the encrypted secrets, but that's available to us. Now, equally, the override that we need for per environment is if we go ahead and go into our environments now, we can see you can set them up in Provar. We right click on here and you can see this is the option to encrypt at an environment level. And the important part of that is if you do use multiple environments, you should definitely be using our override function down here, which means per UAT, you can choose to say, no, it's a different password, it's a different username, and then that all works nicely with the encryption as well. So that's a very brief. There's a lot of information on our help site around how to use encryption. So if you're wanting to use it, it's all in 196 and 195. Please be a guest. Now, I know I'm running tight on time, so I'm just going to whiz through these ones. The other things that are coming up, which we're obviously going to talk to you about in future roadmaps and future webinars, is we have the Lightning Utility Bar support. If you don't know what that is, it's this guy down the bottom, which I've just, which is in red. And basically what we have, let's go back, is things like recent items and notes for productivity. It can, it's more times than not fixed, but it can pop out. That's going to be supported in future Provar versions. We also support now Lambda and AWS REST services. So this is the technology behind Amazon Echo. It's useful for customers and you guys because it scales automatically. You don't have to think about hardware. And really what it means for Provar is we ultimately want to run, in the first use case, web service commands. And Provar is going to be implementing a new connection to manage the AWS signature so we can get access to all of this. So that's another feature that may be useful to you. The other thing we have is really about usability of custom web pages. So as you might know, we do leverage Selenium. When we do fall outside of Salesforce, we do need locators. We use the page object pattern for that. We always have supported, of course, XPath, and we suggest you an XPath, and we had an editor previously that sort of helped you manipulate that. We've spent a lot of time and effort improving that. The initial algorithm would now suggest 3 XPaths, so you might just say, I like number 2, and I'm done. If you choose number 2, you might then think I'd like to tweak it. And what you now see is something like this on the left-hand side, where it shows you all the options, all the different attributes that are available to you, and it will tick the ones that it's currently including. You can go in and tweak that and update it. So it's a real nice XPath editor. Also supports things like text. So obviously we can drag that out of any particular element as well. And the other nice thing it's got is a little, if you type a slash into that big box, it will suggest the next available element as well. And if there's obviously more than one option, it will say it will do that. And you can just essentially choose from the drop down. The next thing we're doing as well, which we're already starting development on, is label strategies. This is in addition to the ability to test by label for Locator, but it's a really interesting concept where we're going to teach Provar Test Builder a formula. And the reason for this is we tend to see certain applications have formulaic ways of displaying their screens. That way means that we can choose this particular screen, the labels are all done like this. We get that definition, and next time you go to the page, Provar will suggest to you, why don't you use the Aptus locator? Why don't you use the Encino label, for example? And we teach Provar how to do it. Going to help with maintenance, and also it should make things a lot more straightforward. So we'll see how that works in practice. Additional reading, we have the release notes, of course. Please do have a look at them to a more verbose description. Also have a look at this thing that Richard mentioned about the DOM inspection tests, and also the release notes in general for Salesforce. We've got the roadmap, which is behind the customer login. And also we have Provar Essentials. At any point in time, please have a look at that. If I haven't really done a full Provar demo today, but if you want that, then go to that link there. So at this point, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to hand back to Hetty, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Geraint. So we'll be going to questions in a minute. So if you'd still like to ask a question, then you've still got time to type that out into the questions box. In the meantime, though, I just wanted to highlight another webinar we have coming up, which Geraint referred to. This is going to be all about Provar's ServiceMax testing capability. So Provar has quite a lot of inbuilt support for ServiceMax. We do both the UI testing and some mobile testing on ServiceMax FSA. So we're looking forward to sharing some more information on that and doing some live demos. Now, signups aren't yet live for this webinar, but they will be opening soon. So if you're on our mailing list, keep an eye out for that alert. If you would like to join the mailing list, there is a link on the next slide. So actually, we can go ahead to the next slide now because we're going to go to questions. And I think we've had a number come in already. So I'll kick things off with this first one, and that is for Richard. So the question is, you mentioned Provar is not impacted by Shadow DOM. So how is Provar addressing that?
Okay, so I need to be careful what I say because there's a lot of intellectual property behind what we're doing. But ultimately, there is a public JavaScript method, a way of accessing Aura components. And what Provar is doing is interacting with those. So these are the same ways in which developers writing components also interact with the Aura framework. So basically, we use those methods, we use the $A commands and other ways of interacting and getting through the public API. We don't just dive in and try and predict or grab the DOM and try and create locators.
That's great. Thanks, Richard. So the next question, I think, is for you, Geraint. It says, where would a JSON file or a CSV file be used? What type of scenario?
Yeah, I think to my mind, we've had this request. That's the reason why it's in the product. And I think a lot of people are moving towards that. And obviously, Salesforce DX uses a lot of JSON as well. But I think I'd sort of alluded to it as we went through, is that ultimately, there are tools which generate test data, and one of the sort of options about exporting that and having that sort of input into the front end of Provar would be JSON. So it is something that's being more and more common. But the good news for us, I guess, is just that we're just interested in making sure we cover databases, CSV, Excel, and if in future you guys think there's another format, we'll certainly invest time and effort in that as well.
Fantastic, thanks. And I think another one for you, Geraint, is about the test run functionality. So it says, I guess we already had the rerun functionality using test cycle. So does the new rerun test run functionality override test cycle?
No, I mean, test cycle is a sort of lesser known feature which we're equally going to be expanding in the future. And that's realistically the original requirements around that was to make sure we can get clean reports, so we could run in different batches and get one single report out the back of it. And we do use test cycles in other ways as well. But the sort of the new feature is really about ease of use. It's within the UI. We've taken the time to select certain test cases out we want to run them, and then unfortunately that wasn't enough. We need to do some future runs to make sure that our new bugs have just been fixed and all that type of stuff. And it's really there. So two options: run the whole thing again if that's what you want, or just the ones that failed.
Fantastic, thanks. So the next question says, is there an option to run Provar tests without triggering the browser, maybe by using headless? I know we have an option to run through Ant, but it still opens up a browser. Would you like to take that one, Richard?
Sure. So actually, earlier, Geraint did a demonstration of Chrome options. So in the Chrome options, as well as specifying things like language, you can also specify headless mode, and that's documented on our website. And in fact, I leave Chrome options set to headless all the time because Test Builder will ignore that because you definitely don't want no browser to show when using Test Builder. So I do all my UI demos and things using Test Builder, and then I leave Chrome options when I want to run a whole batch of scripts locally. So that's something you can use. Chrome options are respected by Ant as well. That's one of the main reasons why it's there, and you can run it in headless mode. So that's exactly what you would do. So go onto the website, and I think we'll probably cover it in our follow-up. We'll send you a link to that on our website of how to set up the headless mode.
Thanks, Richard. So the next question says, regarding the mobile emulation, should we build on mobile resolution first and play it by selecting the iPhone environment? Do you want to take that one, Richard?
So I'm not quite sure what's been asked there, but what we've done is lifted and shifted our support for mobile emulation 1.8 into 1.9, which requires some extra work. So that's in terms of execution. What we don't have is 100% support for all the different phone modes and all the mapping across all those phone modes. So we are adding more in the mobile space. So it'd be worth getting in touch to explain exactly what you're looking to test there on the mobile front and whether you've already mapped those tests or not.
Fantastic. Thanks, Richard. So we're about out of time, so I'm just going to take one final question, and then if we haven't got to your questions, we'll make sure that we follow up by email. So final question then, when should we expect the sales integration package as a public listed app on the Salesforce App Exchange? As of now, it's private, which might not pass security checkpoints. Do you want to take that, Richard?
So assuming you mean the test integration results package, which is the only one I think we've put on there. So there's a new version going through security review at the moment. Basically, when we did version 1, we bundled in both the test objects, test suites, and test executions with some support for being able to hook up a CI process to kick that off for some other applications such as Flowsum. Because we bundled that all together, there were some issues with the first security review in terms of how we stored that in the custom setting. So we've made changes to that for the new version, and we've submitted that through to security review. So depending on the security review cycle, 6 weeks or so, hopefully we'll get a pass for that one, and then it'd be public on the App Exchange.
Fantastic. Thanks, Richard. So that's all the questions that we have time for. So we'll be ending the webinar here. As I said, if we haven't had time to get to your questions, I'll make sure that we follow up with you by email so that you get some answers. Finally, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the webinar, so do please share your feedback in the post-webinar survey. That will appear automatically when this webinar closes. We will be sending around a recording of this session tomorrow, so I'll make sure that that goes over to everyone by email, so feel free to share that or use it to watch it again. So finally, I'd like to say thank you again to our presenters today, Geraint and Richard, and thank you to all of you for attending. We hope to see you on the next one. Thank you. Bye for now.